There is a yellowed photograph hanging on the wall of my study, taken in 1944 on the island of Biak. The man in the picture is so young it's almost hard to believe it's me. I'm leaning against the nose of that aluminum beast, a lucky strike clamped between my fingers, grinning with reckless abandon. But I know what lay behind that smile. It was the ecstasy of survival, a kind of catharsis known only to those who have looked into the mouth of hell over the Pacific and lived to tell the tale. I am Captain Jack Red O'Connell, 39th Fighter Squadron, 5th Air Force, United States Army Air Forces. If you ask me what won the Pacific War, some might say the atomic bomb. Others might point to the flood of Essex-class carriers. But for those of us who were wallowing in the mud of New Guinea and the Solomons back in 1942, there is only one answer. It had two tails, and it flew like a streak of silent lightning. But before I can tell you that story, you have to understand the despair of early 1942. It was a fear that seeped into your marrow, the kind that woke you up screaming in the middle of the night. Back then, the Japanese Zero, Mitsubishi A6M, wasn't just an airplane, it was a myth, an invincible phantom. If you hadn't flown a P-39 Airacobra or a P-40 Warhawk in those days, you cannot imagine the utter helplessness we felt facing the Zero. I remember when we first arrived at Port Moresby, the first piece of advice the veterans gave us was, don't dogfight a Zero. If you see one at your 6 o'clock, pray to God, because you can't out-turn it, you can't out-climb it, and you sure as hell can't outrun it. In those days, the Pacific sky belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their pilots were the elite of the elite, their skills terrifyingly precise. And our P-30s? They were iron coffins, sturdy, sure, but unable to climb. Above 20,000 feet, their engines gasped for air like an asthmatic patient. We were slaughtered at low altitude and mocked at high altitude. Every time we took off, we felt like we were flying to our own funerals. We needed a miracle, or at the very least, something that could defy the laws of physics. In the autumn of 1942, rumors began to circulate through the dirt airstrips of the South Pacific. Hear the news? Brass is sending us something new. Better not be another model of the P-40. If it can't climb, it's just lunch for the Zeros. No, this is different. Heard it's a twin-engine monster built by Lockheed. They call it the Lightning. When I first saw the P-38 on the tarmac, I admit, I froze. It didn't look like a fighter plane at all. It was massive, featuring two slender engine nacelles, which we later called twin booms, flanking a short central cockpit pod. Its tricycle landing gear made it stand proud and level on the ground, unlike the other tail draggers that looked like sitting ducks in the mud. This thing can fight? My wingman, young Second Lieutenant Williams, muttered. It looks like a flying catamaran. It's too big. That was the consensus at the time. The golden rule of fighter combat back then was small, light, agile. The Zero was the ultimate embodiment of that philosophy. The P-38, on the other hand, looked like a cathedral made of aviation aluminum. But as we began our conversion training, doubt turned into shock. It was a machine built for speed and altitude. Two Allison V1710 liquid-cooled engines, each pumping out over 1,000 horsepower. More importantly, it was equipped with General Electric turbo superchargers. This meant that while the Zero's engine started to wheeze from oxygen starvation at 25,000 feet, the P-38 could still roar as if it were at sea level. And then there was the firepower. God, it was the most beautiful violence we had ever seen. Most American fighters, like the P-40 or the Mustang, had their guns mounted in the wings. This meant you had to set a convergence point, usually at 250 or 300 yards. Your bullets would meet at that spot, fire too close or too far, and the pattern spread, losing its lethality. The P-38 was different. All its weaponry was concentrated in that spear-like nose, 4.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, and one 20mm Hispano cannon in the center. "It's a saw, gentlemen," the master sergeant in charge of tech told us, patting the nose. "No convergence issues here. Where you point, you hit. Even at 1,000 yards, this stream of fire is as straight as a laser. If a zero dares to cross your sights, even for a second, this thing will saw it in half." There was another lesser-known detail that revolutionized our flying experience. The P-38's propellers were counter-rotating. Anyone who has flown a single-engine fighter knows the terror of torque. Throttle up too hard on takeoff, and the plane pulls violently to one side. Many rookies died on the runway that way, but the P-38 didn't have that problem. It was as smooth as a Cadillac on a highway. Even so, the debate over whether it could take on the Zero persisted. That is, until December 1942, when we were deployed to the front lines. In the borderlands between the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, the commander of the 5th Air Force, General George Kenney, was a visionary. He told us, "Forget everything you learned in flight school. Do not turn, do not dogfight, use your speed, use your altitude." We began to fumble our way toward a new tactic, what would later be known as energy maneuvering, or, in common parlance, boom and zoom. It sounds simple, but executing it required immense self-control. When you see a Zero biting your buddy's tail, instinct screams at you to yank the stick and turn to save him. But if you do that in a P-38, you bleed speed and become a target. The correct move: climb. Even if the Zero is behind you, just firewall the throttle and pull up. The Zero cannot match your climb rate. Once you hold the altitude advantage, you are God. You push the nose over, speed instantly breaking 400 miles per hour, and drop like a meteor on the enemy. You unleash that terrifying nose-mounted fire in a brief window, then use the dive's momentum to zoom back up to the sanctuary of high altitude. It was a simple physics formula. Potential energy converts to kinetic energy. Kinetic converts back to potential. And the Zero, that kite made of wood and aluminum that prided itself on being lightweight, was helpless against this violent cycle of energy. By December 1942, we were ready. The day was a turning point in history, though we didn't know it at the time. The Japanese had established beachheads at Buna and Gona in New Guinea, threatening Port Moresby. Allied ground forces were slogging through the jungle, and the Japanese Naval Air Service was swarming out of Rabaul to cover their supply lines. At noon, on December 27th, sirens wailed across our dirt airstrip. Radar showed a massive wave of bogies incoming. 39th Squadron, scramble. I jumped into the cockpit, the Allison engines roaring to life. I was leading Red Flight that day. In the revetment next to me was a young lieutenant who had just arrived. Round-faced, soft-spoken, almost shy. His name was Richard Bong. Nobody knew then that this farm boy from Wisconsin would become America's ace of aces. But that day, he was just another hunter thirsting for revenge. We climbed rapidly to 20,000 feet. The air grew thin and cold, but my palms were slick with sweat. Through the canopy, I saw them, black specks swarming below. Japanese D-3A Val dive bombers and their escort, the Zeros. 6 months ago, this sight would have filled me with despair, but today, I was at 20,000 feet. "Red leader, tally ho, looks like a buffet down there," my wingman crackled over the radio. "Maintain altitude, don't drop yet. Pick your targets, dive, then extend. I repeat, do not turn," I yelled. The battle began. I pushed the stick forward. The heavy feel of the P-38 vanished, replaced by the manic climb of the airspeed indicator. The wind noise was drowned out by the shriek of the turbos. My target was a Zero flying on the outer edge of the formation. The Zero pilot was clearly a veteran. He saw me. He did what he was used to doing. He waited until the last second and broke hard to the left. If I were in a P-40, I would have overshot him and he would have been on my tail. But I didn't turn with him. I simply made a slight course correction. My speed was so high that I closed that 1,000-yard gap in a heartbeat. I squeezed the trigger, 4.5 zeros, and the 20-millimeter cannon fired in unison. There was no spread of tracers flying wild. It was a solid whip of fire. I watched that zero disintegrate in midair. Truly, it didn't just catch fire or smoke. It was smashed apart. The 20-millimeter shells tore through the fragile wing root, and the unarmored fuel tanks instantly turned into a fireball. Boom! I used the speed to haul back on the stick. Massive G-forces pinned me to the seat, but the world in front of me shifted rapidly from jungle green to deep blue sky. I glanced back. The zero was nothing but falling scrap metal. And that was when I saw Richard Bong's performance. The kid was crazy. Or maybe he was a genius. Most rookies spray and pray in their first dogfight. Not Bong. I saw his silver P-38 slice into the Japanese bomber formation like a predatory hawk. He blew a Val-dive bomber out of the sky, but instead of pulling up immediately as the manual dictated, he used his remaining kinetic energy to charge straight at a zero that was trying to intercept him from a distance of about 200 yards. That zero had clearly never seen such a suicidal maneuver. In a head-on pass, the P-38's nose-mounted firepower is undefeated. The zero tried to evade, but it was too late. Bong's short burst snipped the canopy clean off. That day, the 39th Fighter Squadron alone claimed over 10 enemy aircraft. And you have to understand, it wasn't just numbers. It was the collapse of a psychological barrier. When we landed, the ground crews swarmed us. In that moment, I realized that Japanese air superiority hadn't just been broken, it had been shattered. "Sir, did you see that?" That zero tried to turn, but I just blew past him, rolled over the top, and hit him again. Williams was as excited as a child. We celebrated in the officers' club, but it wasn't a party. It was a blood-scented excitement. Richard Bong sat in the corner, nursing a Coke. He didn't drink much, wearing that goofy smile. He had shot down 2 that day. "How was it, Dick?" I asked, walking over. He scratched his head. "Plane flies real fast, sir. Think I can do better, though. Wasted too much ammo on the second pass." That was Richard Bong. While we celebrated victory, he was thinking about how to kill more efficiently. From late 1942 into early 1943, the P-38 Lightning earned a new name in this theater. The Japanese began calling it Nidu no Akuma, the twin-tailed devil, because they found that all their proud tactics had been rendered obsolete. Before, the Zero pilot's doctrine was, drag the American into a dogfight. Now, their nightmare was, the Americans are up there and we can't reach them. The P-38 brought a crucial strategic shift, vertical air superiority. Before, air combat was planar, everyone turning in circles in the same slice of sky. The P-38 made combat three-dimensional. We chose when to fight and when to leave. The initiative was entirely in our hands. Furthermore, the P-38 had incredible range. 2 massive drop tanks combined with large internal fuel stores meant we weren't just defending bases. We could go deep behind enemy lines to hunt. This is why we began systematically destroying the Japanese Naval Air Service. We were no longer passively defending. We were taking the fight to Rabaul, to Bougainville, to places the Japanese thought were absolutely safe. Over the next few months, my squadron witnessed a cliff-like drop in the quality of Japanese pilots. In December, we faced veterans capable of dazzling maneuvers. By the spring of 1943, we found more and more Japanese pilots reacting sluggishly, or not at all, to our dives. We were slaughtering their elite. Every veteran shot down by a P-38 was irreplaceable. Japan's training system couldn't keep up with the attrition, and our P-38s were like precision scalpels, excising their core strength. Meanwhile, Another competition quietly began within our ranks, a competition for glory. Richard Bong's kill count was skyrocketing, but in the same theater, another name began to ring out, Thomas Maguire. If Bong was a cold, calculating hunter, Maguire was a combative gladiator. Flying his P-38 named Pudgy, he swore to surpass Bong's record. The rivalry between these two drove the morale of the entire 5th Air Force. Everyone wanted to be the next Bong or Maguire, and the P-38 was our Excalibur. However, the moment we truly realized the strategic value of the P-38 wasn't just in these dogfights. It was a top-secret mission, a mission to avenge Pearl Harbor and break the spine of the Imperial Japanese Navy once and for all. April 1943. Intelligence intercepted a classified cable. Yamamoto Isoroku, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was going to inspect the front lines. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, only one fighter had the range, the speed, and the firepower to accomplish this impossible mission. That's right, only the P-38. Mid-April 1943, a strange silence settled over Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. It wasn't the quiet between battles, but the stifled tension before a storm. By the muddy runway, ground crews were fitting our P-38s with enormous drop tanks, 310-gallon tanks, or maybe 165s. Point is, they were ridiculously huge. "Where are we flying? San Francisco?" my wingman joked. But I didn't laugh. I had seen a group of high-ranking brass in the command tent who had no business being there. It was the evening of April 17th when Major John Mitchell called a select few of us into the briefing hut. The air smelled of moldy canvas and strong tobacco. Mitchell's face was hard as iron. "Gentlemen, keep your mouths shut," he pointed to a long red line on the map. "We just got the green light from Washington. The target isn't a base. It isn't a convoy. It's a man." He paused, his eyes scanning each of us. Yamamoto Isoroku. You could have heard a pin drop. Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, the god of the Japanese military. To us, he was the devil incarnate. Intelligence knew he would be inspecting the front lines at Bougainville the next morning, but it was practically a suicide mission. We had to take off from Guadalcanal, fly a massive dogleg of over 400 miles, avoid all Japanese radar stations, and intercept him at a precise point over Bougainville at an exact second. 1 minute early, he hasn't arrived. 1 minute late, he's already landed. Only one plane can do this. Major Mitchell patted the P-38 model behind him. Only the Lightning. The Navy's Wildcats had legs too short. The Corsairs weren't carrier cleared yet and lacked the range. Only the P-38, with its twin-engine redundancy and massive fuel load, could haul heavy ordnance that far, fight, and fly back. Nobody slept that night. Lying on my cot, listening to the insects in the tropical rainforest, I thought about the long flight ahead. This wasn't just an assassination. This was a statement to the Japanese. Nowhere in the Pacific is safe, not even for your supreme commander. Dawn, April 18th. The runway at Henderson Field held 16 P-38s sitting quietly, like sharks waiting to feed. Major Mitchell led the formation personally, divided into the killer flight for the attack and the top cover flight for protection. I was assigned to the cover group. It meant I would witness history, but I had to suppress the urge to dive and attack, ensuring no escorting Zeros could interfere with Thomas Lanphier and Rex Barber's hunt. 0725. Engines roared. The P-38's stable tricycle gear allowed us to lift off smoothly, even laden with heavy fuel. Once airborne, we immediately dropped to the deck. This was the torture. To evade radar, we had to fly less than 50 feet above the water. Imagine flying at over 200 miles per hour. We flew slow to save gas, skimming the wave tops. No landmarks, no radio navigation. We relied entirely on Major Mitchell's pocket watch and the wind data he calculated on his kneeboard. The glare off the water was blinding, and staring at it for hours played tricks on your eyes, merging sea and sky. Nod off for a second, twitch the stick, and you're shark bait. The cockpit was stifling, no ventilation, sweat stinging our eyes. We flew like that for over 2 hours. Radio silence was absolute. Even if you saw a wingman crash, you couldn't break silence. We were ghosts passing through the belly of the Pacific. 0934. Just as the time calculated by Major Mitchell approached, the coastline of Bougainville appeared. Simultaneously, the code phrase broke the silence in our headsets, the voice trembling slightly with tension. Bogies, 11 o'clock high. My God, they were actually there. 2 G-4M Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros, preparing to land. Our intelligence was terrifyingly accurate. We had flown 400 miles to collide with Yamamoto at this exact minute, this exact second. It was destiny. Drop tanks, full throttle. At the command, I pulled the release lever. The P-38s transformed instantly. Heavy tanks tumbled into the jungle, and the twin Allisons roared, turbos screaming. We in the cover flight surged to 20,000 feet to block any Zeros trying to counterattack. Below, the killer flight dove like hungry wolves on the 2 bombers. Through the canopy, I watched the brief, brutal chase. The escorting Zero pilots were caught completely off guard. They never imagined American fighters would appear this deep in their rear area. They dove desperately to intercept, but the P-38s were too fast. I saw Barber and Lanfear slice in from behind. We called the G-4M bomber the one-shot lighter because its fuel tanks lacked self-sealing capability. One hit, and they torched. The concentrated nose fire of the P-38 displayed its horrific destructive power once again. I saw tracers connect Barber's plane to one of the bombers like a laser beam. No unnecessary maneuvering, no Hollywood dogfighting, just pure speed, calculation, and firepower. The bomber carrying Yamamoto, later confirmed, began trailing thick smoke from its right engine. Then the wing snapped, and it tumbled like a dead leaf into the dense jungle. Boom! A massive orange fireball and a column of black smoke rose above the green canopy. In that moment, I knew the tide of the war had shifted. The arrogant strategist, the marshal who boasted he would dictate peace terms in the White House, met his end at the hands of an aluminum machine built by Lockheed and flown by a few American boys. We didn't linger. Mission accomplished. All P-38s used their speed to disengage. The Zeros chased furiously, but in a low-altitude, high-speed run, the P-38 left them choking on exhaust. On the flight back, the radio discipline held, but you could feel the explosive euphoria in the air. When we landed at Henderson, Lanfear was pumping his fist before he even opened the canopy. Ground crews rushed up, staring in awe at our empty tanks. Some planes had gauges reading 0, gliding in on fumes. That was another P-38 miracle. It took us to hell, killed the devil, and brought us home. Yamamoto's death was the P-38's strategic masterpiece, but in the daily grind of air combat, the legend of the Lightning was written by 2 names, Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire. By mid-1943, as the front moved forward, the rivalry between these two hit a fever pitch. I saw them both on Biak. They were opposites like the twin booms of the P-38 itself, parallel but distinct. Bong was a natural. He flew the P-38 like it was an extension of his body. He didn't care much for theory, he relied on instinct. He flew low, using the jungle for cover, then pulled up for a surprise attack. He was humble, almost wooden. If you asked him how he shot down a plane, he'd say, "I just flew up, shot it, and it fell down." Maguire was a technician. He was the guy who memorized the flight manual and filled the margins with notes. He was supremely confident, bordering on arrogant. He wrote a pamphlet on P-38 tactics and forced everyone in his squadron to memorize it. His motto, Never turn your back on the enemy. Their race of aces electrified the 5th Air Force. "Hey Red, hear Bong got 2 more yesterday?" McGuire asked me once at the officers' bar, swirling his drink, eyes glinting with competitive fire. "Yeah, Tommy, he's at 21. You're at 19, I replied. McGuire huffed. "Just wait. I'll catch that Wisconsin farm boy." It was a healthy rivalry and a lethal one for the Japanese. Because they kept pushing the envelope, morale in the P-38 groups was sky high. Every new pilot wanted to mimic Bong's deflection shooting or learn McGuire's energy management. During this period, we perfected the ultimate tactic against Japanese fighters. We discovered that while the Zero had great horizontal maneuverability, its ailerons stiffened up in a high-speed dive, making it almost impossible to roll. The P-38 had issues with compressibility, the nose getting heavy at high Mach, but Lockheed installed dive flaps for us. It was practically cheating. Whenever I encountered a new Chi-61 Tony or an improved Zero Model 52, I'd bait them into a dive. Once the speed crossed 400 miles per hour, the Japanese pilot would be wrestling with a frozen stick trying to pull out while I just flicked the dive flaps switch. The P-38 would obediently lift its nose, allowing me to place the reticle steadily on the enemy. Throughout that year, we systematically harvested the lives of the Japanese Naval Air Service. We were no longer the frightened birds of 1942 fighting for survival. We had become cold-blooded aerial hunters. I remember once over Wewak, McGuire led us into a swarm of Japanese bombers preparing to take off. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The P-38 cannons turned the planes on the runway into strings of fireballs. McGuire shouted over the radio, "That's the interest, for Pearl Harbor!" By the end of 1943, the P-38 was the undisputed ruler of the Pacific skies. Our kill ratio hit a staggering 7-1. For every P-38 lost, 7 Japanese planes went down. More importantly, the P-38's survivability was frighteningly high. In a P-40 or a Zero, if you lost the engine, you were done. But the P-38 had 2. I lost an engine in combat several times. In any other plane, I would have bailed out. But I just feathered the dead prop, throttled up the good one, and limped hundreds of miles back to base. For a pilot, that security is priceless. It gave us the guts to make bold moves, to fly deep into enemy territory. However, the war wasn't over. As our island-hopping campaign pushed further, Japanese resistance grew more desperate. They began fielding advanced fighters like the Frank, Chi-84, and the George, N-1K2, trying to challenge the P-38's reign. And the legend of Bong and McGuire was approaching its final, tragic conclusion. By mid-1944, our front had pushed to Hollandia, New Guinea. The island-hopping strategy was a giant steel clamp tightening around the throat of the Japanese Empire. The P-38 had evolved. We moved to the J model and later the L model. New intercoolers, and most importantly, hydraulically boosted ailerons. God, that was a stroke of genius. Before, in a high-speed dive, banking required the strength of a weightlifter. Now, with 2 fingers, this multi-ton twin-engine beast could roll as lightly as a swallow. It was around this time a strange visitor arrived at our base. He was a tall civilian in ill-fitting khakis, balding, quiet. At first, us arrogant fighter jocks didn't pay him much mind until someone recognized him, Charles Lindbergh, the legend who flew solo across the Atlantic. He was there as a tech rep for United Aircraft. Though a civilian due to politics, he did something that left the 5th Air Force jaw-dropped. In the briefing room, Lindbergh stood by the chalkboard, pointing at the P-38's fuel consumption curve. "You're flying it wrong. You can fly further." I wanted to laugh. We risked our necks daily. What did a civilian flying male know about combat? "Your current cruise settings are high RPM, low manifold pressure," Lindbergh said calmly. If you drop the RPM to 1600 and increase the manifold pressure, you save 30% on fuel. That'll wreck the engines, someone protested. Low RPM and high torque causes detonation. It won't, Lindbergh insisted. I've tested it myself. Under this civilian's lead, we tried this counterintuitive method. The results shocked everyone. The P-38's loiter time stretched from a limit of 6 hours to 8, even 9 hours. This meant our combat radius expanded again. We could fly missions without those clumsy drop tanks or haul bombs to places we never dreamed of reaching. Lindbergh even flew combat patrols in a P-38, strictly against regulations, but nobody snitched. Once, over Biak, I saw this 40-something civilian coolly shoot down a Japanese Sonya recon plane. He flew like he was repairing a watch, precise, calm, no wasted motion. That was the charm of the P-38. It was a precision instrument. If you understood it, it worked miracles. If you think the P-38 only fought in the air, you're dead wrong. By late 1944, Japanese planes were scarce, so our job shifted to ground attack. It was the dirtiest, most exhausting, most dangerous work. Imagine flying a twin-engine heavy fighter with over 2,000 horsepower strapped with two 1,000-pound bombs, or those terrifying napalm tanks shrieking over the treetops. We weren't knights anymore. We were butchers. The Japanese used barges to move supplies along the coast at night. Our job was sweeping. The 4.50s and the 20mm cannon were a destructive storm against fragile wooden barges or trucks. I remember a mission during the Leyte campaign. Intel spotted a Japanese convoy trying to cross the jungle. Red flight, attack run. I pushed into a dive. The green canopy expanded rapidly in my windscreen. I saw the winding dirt road and the line of trucks. I pulled the trigger. The nose of the P-38 vibrated violently, but because the guns were centerline, the sight remained rock steady. I watched tracers hose down the convoy like water. The first truck exploded instantly, debris flying high. The 20mm HE shells mowed down infantry like grass. No convergence issues. 500 yards or 50 yards, our fire tore targets apart. But low-level attack was lethal. Japanese AA was crude but dense. A stray 7.7mm rifle bullet hitting a coolant line meant your Allison engine would seize up in minutes. I lost several friends in those months, not to Zeros, but to nameless jungle flak or hitting a coconut tree pulling out of a strafing run. Through the mud and blood, Bong and McGuire remained our beacons. As we closed on the Japanese home defense ring, the enemy fought with the madness of the doomed. Their gear got better. The flammable Zeros became rare. In their place came the Nakajima Ki 84 Frank and the Kawanishi N1K2 George. I remember my first encounter with a Frank over the Philippines. My wingman and I were patrolling at 20,000 feet. Two dark green Japanese fighters popped out of the clouds. Out of habit, I pegged them as improved Zeros and initiated a standard B and Z run. But the script flipped. As I dove, the Japanese plane didn't clumsily try to turn horizontally. He pushed his nose down and kept up with my dive. "Damn, this thing is fast," I yelled. It was a Frank, one of Japan's best. Armor, powerful engine, heavy guns. In a P-40, I'd be dead. But thank God I was in a P-38L. I popped the dive flaps and used the hydraulic ailerons to execute a violent barrel roll. The P-38's superior vertical energy retention saved me. I dragged him into a climbing spiral. That was the P-38's trump card. You might be faster now, but I'm still stronger. But after that fight, looking at the bullet holes in my wing, my hands trembled. The Japanese were thrashing in their death throes, and their fangs were sharper than ever. In late 1944, Richard Bong's score froze at 40. He was an American hero, a living legend. The brass decided he couldn't be risked anymore. Losing the nation's top ace would be a devastating blow to morale. Bong was ordered home. I remember the day he left, standing by his P-38 Marge, named after his fiancée, looking forlorn. The Wisconsin farm boy didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted to fly. But he had to go, to sell war bonds and become a test pilot. "Watch out for Tommy, will ya?" Bong told me before he left. "Don't let him do anything stupid." He knew McGuire. With Bong gone, Thomas McGuire became the top-scoring active pilot, 38 kills, too shy of Bong's record. It became McGuire's obsession. He frantically wanted to break that number. He wanted to prove he was the best. That desire eventually consumed him. January 7th, 1945. Negros Island, Philippines. A day no P-38 pilot will ever forget. I was in the air that day, but in a different sector. The radio waves were filled with chaotic shouting. McGuire was leading 4 P-38s at extreme low altitude, about 200 feet, searching for targets. It was a risky call. At that height, a P-38 has no room to trade potential energy for speed. Worse, expecting no heavy combat, McGuire still had those massive drop tanks attached. Fate played a cruel joke. A lone Japanese Ki-43 Oscar appeared. The Oscar was obsolete, but it had one trait. At low altitude and low speed, it was the king of horizontal maneuverability, even more agile than a Zero. The Japanese pilot was a master, later identified as Warrant Officer Akira Sugimoto, an instructor. Instead of running, he used the terrain and his agility to latch onto the tail of McGuire's wingman, Thad Wolf. "Help! I can't shake him!" Wolf screamed. McGuire panicked. To save his wingman, he violated the 3 cardinal sins of flying a P-38. He was at low altitude. He hadn't dropped his tanks. He tried to pull a high G turn to get a bead on the Oscar. I didn't see it happen, but the surviving wingmen described it later, and it breaks my heart. To get the angle, McGuire yanked the stick back hard. The heavy P-38, laden with full tanks, was forced to its limit at low speed. Stall. At 20,000 feet, a stall is a nuisance. You push the nose down and recover. At 200 feet, it's a death sentence. The legendary fighter with 38 kill marks snap-rolled and fell like a stone into the jungle. "McGuire is down. I repeat, McGuire is down." The scream on the radio turned my blood to ice. No parachute, no miracle survival. Thomas McGuire, the second highest ace of the Pacific, died in a desperate maneuver to save a friend. That night, the mess hall was dead silent. Bong was gone. McGuire was dead. Our 2 giants, one returned to a cage of glory, the other buried in a foreign wilderness. Though we kept fighting, kept shooting down Japanese planes, I felt an era had ended. The era of the individual hunter, the knights of the air, was over. What remained was the cold, grinding machinery of war. We didn't know then that a few months later, Richard Bong, safe at home, would die testing a new jet plane. Fate is cruel to heroes. But the war didn't stop for heroes. Spring 1945 arrived, and the P-38 groups got a new mission. We were to escort an unprecedented armada to bomb the place we hated most, the Japanese home islands. And there, I would fly the final chapter of my career. Spring 1945. The air no longer held the romance of a duel. It was replaced by a sickening madness. We were stationed on Aishima near Okinawa. The mud rivaled New Guinea in '42, but the enemy's tactics had changed completely. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service was dead in the water. We no longer scanned the heavens for fighter formations because they had no organized fighters left. Now, our enemy was the kamikaze. The P-38's role shifted dramatically. We became the fleet's goalkeepers. Every day, hundreds of Japanese planes, some ancient biplane trainers, strapped with bombs, swarmed like possessed hornets toward our fleet. Their pilots knew only how to take off, not how to land. For us veteran P-38 pilots, it was a turkey shoot, but also a psychological torture. More than once, I looked through my gun sight at faces that looked criminally young. They didn't evade, they didn't maneuver. They just stared dead ahead at a destroyer or carrier, even as my .50 calibers turned their wings into Swiss cheese. Red leader, radar here. Vector 270, 20 miles, low angels. I pushed the nose down again. The P-38L's hydraulic ailerons allowed me to react instantly in the thick air. It was an old Key 43 Oscar. I sliced in from his high 6. It was too easy, sinfully easy. I didn't even need deflection. I just put the pipper on his canopy and squeezed. 4 heavy machine guns and a cannon sheared the tail off the fragile plane. It tumbled into the sea, kicking up a white splash. No shoot. I felt no joy of victory, just exhaustion. This wasn't war anymore. It was mass suicide. And the P-38, a precision machine built for air superiority, had become an efficient undertaker. But the P-38's versatility peaked at Okinawa. Besides intercepting kamikazes, we carried rockets and napalm. If you've seen a P-38 drop napalm, you never forget it. We'd come in at treetop level over Japanese bunkers, releasing those jelly-filled drop tanks. Pull up, look back, and the whole hill would be covered in orange hellfire. By then, the P-38 was no longer the elegant, twin-tailed devil. It was the Grim Reaper's scythe. August 6th, 1945. 2 things happened that day that shook my world. First, the obvious. A B-29 dropped a bomb called Little Boy on Hiroshima. We listened to radio reports about destroying a whole city and looked at each other, unable to comprehend that kind of power. But the second thing hit me, and all P-38 pilots, harder than the atomic bomb. Later that evening, a comms officer handed me a telegram, his face grim. "Jack, you need to see this." The wire was brief. Major Richard Bong, killed this day in Burbank, California, while testing P-80 jet fighter. I crumpled the paper, feeling like a hand had squeezed my heart. Dick, that shy, coke-drinking farm boy, the lucky bastard who survived 40 kills and countless scrapes in the Pacific. He didn't die to a Zero's cannon or jungle malaria. He died right as the war was ending, in his own backyard, testing the future. McGuire was gone. Now, Bong was gone. That night, I sat alone on the wing of my P-38, staring at the black Okinawa sky. The P-80 Shooting Star, Lockheed's first jet, the future, and the P-38 beneath me, this piston-engine warrior that roared like thunder, suddenly felt old. They belonged to the same era, Bong, McGuire, the Lightning. An era that, while brutal, still valued individual skill, courage, and a bit of luck. The atomic bomb and the jet engine declared that era dead. I patted the cold aluminum skin, like soothing an old warhorse before retirement. "We're running out of time, pal," I whispered. Though the bomb stunned the world, the surrender needed a ceremony. August 19th, 1945. The P-38's final, and perhaps most glorious, historical appearance. Japan announced its surrender, and envoys had to fly to Manila to discuss terms. General MacArthur's orders were explicit. The Japanese delegation must fly in 2 G-4M Betty bombers, painted white with green crosses, to Ieshima. And the aircraft chosen to escort these former mortal enemies? The P-38. It wasn't just for range, only the P-38 could easily handle the long-distance escort, but for symbolism. The twin-tailed devil that shattered Japan's air superiority would now shepherd their surrender envoys. I was lucky enough to be in that flight. The sky was blindingly clear. We circled the rendezvous point until those 2 clumsy bombers, painted with those bizarre green crosses, appeared. It was the most surreal sight of my life. Years ago, if we saw a Betty, the only reaction was nose down, aim, fire, fireball. Now, flying fully armed P-38s, I drifted silently alongside them, close enough to see the empty gun turrets and the rigid, fearful profile of the Japanese pilot. Radio silence. No one spoke. No one needed to. Watching those two planes, representing the last shreds of the imperial dignity, flying obediently toward Ieshima under the guard of 6 gleaming silver lightnings. That feeling of conquest was 10,000 times stronger than shooting down any Zero. When we landed at Ieshima, cameras and reporters swarmed. Watching the Japanese envoys step off, I knew my war was truly over. The months following the war brought a sadness harder to describe than the war itself. It was the sadness of farewell. America had incredible industrial capacity, which also meant incredible waste. Once the war ended, thousands of fighters became instant scrap. Shipping them home cost too much, so most faced destruction in the field. At the boneyard in Clarkfield, Philippines, I saw the most heartbreaking sight of my life. Rows of brand new P-38Ls, some with less than 10 flight hours, parked in perfect lines. There was no ceremony, just bulldozers. I watched those spirits that once shrieked at 20,000 feet get their twin booms snapped by bulldozer blades, pushed into piles like broken birds. Allison engines smashed, precision instruments crushed. I found my plane. Number 44-25689. She had seen me through the Okinawa campaign, my 12 kill marks still painted on her nose. I walked over and sat in the cockpit one last time. The smell of old leather, fuel, and the metallic safety of the aluminum cocoon. I gripped the yoke, that unique wheel-like control column, and closed my eyes. I could hear the turbo superchargers screaming again, feel the blood-pumping vibration of a dive, see Richard Bong's shy smile in the clouds, see the glint of sun off McGuire's Pudgy. I unscrewed the clock from the instrument panel, the only keepsake she would leave me. As I climbed out, an engineer with a torch walked up. "Area's gotta be cleared, Captain." I nodded and patted the long engine nacelle one last time. "Goodbye, twin-tailed devil," I whispered. "Thanks for bringing me home." Back to reality. I crushed the Lucky Strike into the ashtray. The yellowed photo still hangs on the wall, the young man leaning against the P-38, smiling so brightly. People ask me, was the P-38 the best fighter of World War II? Some choose the P-51 Mustang, the darling of Europe. Others pick the F-6F Hellcat, the top killer of the Pacific. But in my heart, no plane replaces the P-38 Lightning. It was the beacon of hope in our darkest hour. In the despair of 1942, its unique silhouette told us the Zero wasn't invincible. It accomplished the impossible mission to kill Yamamoto, turning the strategic tide. It created legends like Bong and McGuire. It wasn't perfect. The cockpit was an icebox at altitude, the tail buffeted in high-speed dives, and it was as big as a barn door. But it gave us one thing: choice. We chose when to fight and when to leave. We chose to fly higher, fly faster. In the Pacific skies, where the line between life and death was razor thin, that was a gift from God. I am old now, old enough to forget what I had for breakfast, but I will never forget those counter-rotating props, nor the tremor of 4 machine guns firing in unison. Whenever a thunderstorm rolls in and I hear the thunder rumble, I instinctively look to the sky. Deep in the clouds, I can almost still see that streak of silver lightning, tearing through the heavens, fading, but never gone.